What is happening in and to China? Well, a lot of it's bad if you live there and you're pro-democracy or you're practicing Catholic or you oppose communism. Joining us to sort all the problems of the world, at least that part of it, is the former ambassador of Canada to China, David Mulroney, right here on The Patrick Coffin Show. This episode brought to you by Coffin Nation. Click that link, coffinnation.com. Find out what Catholics and other sinners in over 25 countries are learning and enjoying. Exclusive content, commentary, bit of sarcasm. We talk about movies and the sources of culture and try to grow in discipleship of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ as Catholics. Check out coffinnation.com. It's upstream from politics, and we have more fun than canon law permits. As promised, our guest today is the former ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China, Mr. David Mulroney. He's the author of the book I now hold and have just enjoyed. It's called Middle Power, Middle Kingdom, What Canadians Need to Know About China in the 21st Century. He is now, among other things, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. He joins us now from beautiful and warm and sunny Toronto. Hello, David. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Patrick. Good to see you.
I love the book. I'm kind of a history buff, but this is part biography, part modern history. It made me wonder what happens before this book began. How did you become interested in public service and governmental affairs? How did that? Was that something you wanted to do when you were 7, or did you come late to it?
It was something I wanted to do early on. Partly it was my father who was very interested in public affairs. I have a connection that I share with you to Halifax, Nova Scotia. We're both Haligonians. He was in the Royal Canadian Navy and a great believer in public service. And then I had two aunts who were considerably older, one an aunt, one a cousin. Both of them had worked in Ottawa in different jobs. My family was from Ottawa originally. And so it seemed something I was interested in, and the idea of foreign service in particular was particularly appealing.
Did you simply get assigned to China after you were the deputy minister in charge of the engagement of Canada in Afghanistan? How did China come into your wheelhouse?
Well, what had happened was, my wife and I took an extended honeymoon trip to various exotic places, including India. And we traveled widely in India in the 70s. Always hoped to get posted there, never made it. And I got to Korea first. Then I did Chinese language training at the Canadian Forces Language School. And once you've done that, the government says, basically, Mulroney, you're going to be going back to China a couple of times because we want to get our money's worth. So when I was wrapping up many, many years later on the Afghanistan work, the job that seemed logical, there was an opening as head of mission in Beijing, and was the right place at the right time. So it was a good way to end my career in government.
Did you find Mandarin impossible at the beginning, or was it a nice match as you went along?
It was, in the words of my one of my teachers, difficult but not impossible. The grammar is relatively simple, but the tones are difficult, and so you can have the same basic syllable meaning different things depending on the tone you give it. But Chinese people are very forgiving. They're very kind if you attempt to speak their language, and they help you along.
Mm-hmm. So there's a way to say, take the garbage out, honey, that's either annoyed or full of love and praise, all depending on tone.
That's right. Or you could be saying, take this bag of money out and throw it in the garbage by accident. So you the same thing, the same sound can mean something different. So you got to be very careful. Right. Or you may not have said honey. Gotcha.
Growing up in Halifax, I think I spent more time than you did in Halifax, owing to your dad's service and so on. I proudly post the Blue Nose, at the time the fastest schooner in the world in the 1920s, and so I feel close to Canadians and to Canada. I've been in Southern California for over 20 years, but I love going back home there. And it reminds me of the time that I got to meet Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He was still Prime Minister. He came to speak at Dalhousie, I think, and there was a big reception, and I shook his hand, and as he was walking away, I thought I just shook a bit of Canadian history. Your term of service for the government almost overlapped with his time as Prime Minister, correct? Did you have any interactions with him?
I only met him after he had retired, when he came to China, and he was as interesting and enigmatic. But as a young man, when I'd go up to visit my relatives in Ottawa, we'd go to the Saturday evening mass at St. Bridget's Church, which is in Lowtown, which is where all the Irish and the French live. And just as Mass was starting, a sports car would pull up. Out would hop Prime Minister Trudeau. He'd come from his cottage at Harrington Lake on the weekends in the summer, and he'd be there at Mass. So that was kind of inspiring for me.
He used to go to the John Main Benedictine place in Montreal when I studied at McGill. He was sort of the guy at the back, enigmatic's probably a good way to put him. That's a whole other. I could do 4 more shows just on his legacy, but he certainly was a trailblazer with respect to engaging China. He kind of demystified China to a certain extent, at least to Canadians growing up. Very few other leaders from the West were willing to go and cross the the bamboo line and get to know these people.
What's really interesting is that in 1960, China invited a lot of foreign intellectuals to come and see China. Why did they do this? Because they were winding down from the colossal disaster, the great human tragedy of the program that Mao had called the Great Leap Forward. It was anything but. Mm-hmm. And it resulted in mass starvation throughout China. So eager to put the best possible face on things, they invited these people, and they took them on kind of Potemkin village tours to see things. So, Field Marshal Montgomery of the British Army was invited. François Mitterrand, the leader of France, was there. Trudeau and his colleague Gerard Hébert, who there were 2 Quebec intellectuals, rising stars in the Canadian scene, were invited. And to their credit, although I think Trudeau was sometimes, both with Mao and with Fidel Castro and others, a little too inclined to be friendly with dictators, they were honest about what they saw. So they wrote this book in 1960. By 1968, Trudeau's prime minister. And what he says in the book is, I didn't think that Canadian foreign policy could be complete as we were going into the second half of the 20th century without some kind of relationship with China. And so he made that the priority of his new government. And in that, I think he was, ahead of his time, and he could sort of see into the future.
Have things gotten worse under Xi Jinping as far as China's hegemony and their desire to crack down on dissident voices? We just, as you and I are talking now, Catholic philanthropist, and he's called a media mogul, I'm not sure if that's accurate, Jimmy Lai has been arrested. Another pro-democracy, vocal opponent of communism. The crackdowns seem to be coming more left, right, and center, and very few countries are willing to say, enough. Slap on any kind of tariff or punish us. Do what you need to know. We're going to speak out against this. Are things worse in the last 5 years than they were during your term of service?
They've been getting steadily worse. Although, and I talk about this a lot in my book, it certainly wasn't perfect when I was there. I got to China as ambassador in 2009, which was, of course, just as the economic crisis in the West was reaching its nadir. And to be honest and to be fair, China managed to pull out of it. It pumped money into various industries and projects, some efficient, many not so efficient, and it was it helped to lift a lot of other economies. But what was happening in 2009, and what really surprised me, was all kinds of foreign visitors would come to China and they'd say to the Chinese, we've seen the future, it's China, how have you done this? We're so grateful. Not seeing all the cracks between, the sort of shiny projects, all the slums and the problems and the displaced people. And they began to say things like, maybe your system of government is so efficient. They made the trains run on time argument. Right. So this was under the leadership of the previous leader named Hu Jintao. So my assessment at the time was that China was beginning to believe its own headlines. If everybody tells you that you can walk on water, that you're a miracle worker, it's hard not to begin believing that. So China began to get more arrogant. I think, and to speak frankly about the Obama administration, how had the Obama administration launched its relationship with China? Well, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had said basically, if we can have a good relationship, we're not going to push so hard on human rights, and we'll tone that down a little bit because we want we want things to move smoothly. When you say that to the Chinese, as she did, they take that to the bank, and it's a signal of weakness. It's a signal. So President Obama's first trip to China in 2009, along with Canadian Prime Minister Harper, also traveled late in the year, was relatively unsuccessful because the Chinese did not give him the kind of respect they would normally give a U.S. president. So by the end of that first decade of the new century, China was feeling its oats, and it was feeling confident that the rest of the world was going to give it the space and the room that it was insisting on. Xi Jinping arrives a few years later, and he doubles down on this. He's a guy whose father was punished by the party and almost he was incarcerated for many years. Xi himself had to go down into the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. But the lesson he took from that is it's safer to be inside the tent, the party's big tent, than outside. So he became the ultimate party man. The other thing he did that's really significant is China had, up to this point, the one really important thing they had done was they'd worked out a transition system that was not bloody. There was a process of identifying the next leader about 10 years out, grooming him, building consensus around him. And so there was a sense that we've now got this leadership succession. We've got a consensus around him. It's not democratic, but it's better than what we had. She's busted that up and said he'll rule as long as he wants to rule. So that's a significant development.
It's a slight analogy, but I don't think it snaps and falls apart. I'm reading Whittaker Chambers' book, Witness, a convert away from Soviet-style communism. And the Xi Jinping story reminds me of a lot of the testimony of former communists that they entered into a kind of Stockholm Syndrome agreement. That when you said safer inside the tent, well, they kind of doubled and tripled down on rising in the very structure that threatened their family and their livelihood and their lives. Almost a Faustian bargain to at least you know the devil you know, because now the devil's you. Does that make sense? Am I overplaying the card?
And so he would say exactly that, and that the party delivers what they value most, which is stability. And it also keeps them in power and privilege on into the future. And what that's meant is where there have been economic reforms going up until the end of the last decade, suddenly the party starts to become more important than these rising firms. And the role of the party in these firms becomes more important, which is significant. But the other thing that starts to happen on sort of on steroids is the party has always had, they have a special organization called the United Front. And what the United Front organization within the party does is it identifies and counters enemies to the party's rule in China, but also internationally. So the United Front began to get a lot more active in diaspora communities, on college campuses, in the media, in many countries. So we've seen Australia and New Zealand pushing back. We've seen the United States push back. Canada has been slower to wake up, in my view, but we've got a significant problem on all those levels. And this is China at work trying to destabilize. In the case of Canada, the objective is to split Canada away from its relationship with the United States, to weaken that relationship, and to advance its objectives that way.
I wonder if there could be a higher contrast between the attitude of former prime ministers and the current one. Prime Minister Trudeau seems out of the box, downright enthusiastic, not just for the Chinese people, but for the CCP. He said several things in public that I thought were jaw-dropping. I don't want to put you on the spot. I know you're a former ambassador, but the contrast seems bright and vivid.
It is remarkable. And I'm sure we'll get to this, but unfortunately there's a connection to another one of our leaders, and that is the Holy Father. Certain people have this unfathomable sort of fascination and romantic attachment to the Communist Party. So in the Justin Trudeau, our current prime minister, before he became prime minister, he was asked a question about what country do you most admire, and he said, well, I admire China. I admire their basic dictatorship. And again, he said something very foolish and very naive about how they get things done. And he's since, recanted. But to my mind, the thing that shows him most starkly is that a couple of years ago, he attempted to negotiate a free trade agreement, and being Justin Trudeau and quite woke, he'd introduced these progressive elements. So it had things on feminism and the environment, inclusivity. The notion that China would alter its domestic the Communist Party would cede control for a free trade agreement with Canada. It was the height of naivete. So he's really struggled with this. He's recanted what he said, but I think he's still kind of starry-eyed, and that's a problem for us.
There might be some parallel with the Sino-Vatican Accord. I spoke with people like Brigadier General Robert Spalding of the United States. He was a military attaché to Beijing. He wrote a book called Stealth War. You may have seen it.
I've met him.
How China took over.
Canada. Very interesting guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Also, Dr. Stephen Mosier, who is one of the first Western social scientist allowed in. Stephen went in as an atheist and came out as a pro-life Catholic, seeing what he saw on the ground there. And Archbishop Sorondo, prominent Curio member, was given one of these Potemkin, happy, shiny people tours, and that formed a lot of the optics that guided people like Uncle Ted McCarrick, Cardinal Parolin, to enter into this agreement, which essentially gives the CCP veto power over the Catholic Pope's ability to appoint bishops. I'm trying to connect with Cardinal Zen, because here's another high contrast. No previous pontiff allowed Catholics who are ironically united to Rome to stay underground, to stay in the persecution zone, and to treat the above-ground patriotic Catholic community as a legitimate church, which it is not. I
had the wonderful opportunity to meet Cardinal Zen in my sort of second act. For a few years, I ran the Catholic University, St. Michael's here in Toronto, and we made sure that when Cardinal Zen was in town, he came and he met with our students, and it was impressive. The other great cardinal that I met, and talk about being in the presence of a saint. When I served in Shanghai in the mid-'80s, I learned that Cardinal Kung, who had been in prison for 30 years and had been made cardinal by St. John Paul II, was in house arrest outside of Shanghai. And one of the great things about being in the Foreign Service is you can go and do interesting things and meet interesting people. So I arranged to go see him, and there he was. He ultimately moved on to the United States and died in the United States. But in his presence, I knew I was in the presence of a saint. And his story is that when the communists took over in 1949, eventually they got to the great religions of China, including Catholicism, and they tried to bend them to the will of the Communist Party. He was taken to a sports stadium, and he was told to denounce the church. And he took the microphone and he said, "Long live Christ the King, long live the Pope." And those words of truth cost him 30 years in prison. So there are these people who give you such, you can still meet them. And I think Cardinal Zen is one. Cardinal Sarah is another person we had on campus, very impressive. But the thing about Cardinal Kung was that he realized that the greatest gift you can give to the church in China is witness and courage. People they're not impressed by some political deal that you did with the Communist Party. They know the Communist Party. They don't like the Communist Party. But if you're willing to sacrifice, they're willing to sacrifice too. And we're forgetting in this dialogue that the people of China, the faithful of China, are part of the conversation, and they're not being heard.
It was reported that the Vatican received over $2 billion every year since 2018. The Vatican is definitely running at a deficit. There's massive, famous, or infamous corruption that my friend, Cardinal George Pell, was getting to the bottom of before his suspect allegations arose out of nowhere. Do you think there's truth to that? Because it's floating around. Someone said it on Steve Bannon's podcast. It makes a lot of pieces come together, if so.
So I've heard that. I have no indication one way or another. But what I would say, and it's a problem with this, Pope, is that when you allow things to remain ambiguous, right, you create a bit of chaos. The dimensions of this agreement are still not evident. 2 years after it was entered into, of course people are going to speculate. How does China work? It's very often involving money. It's also, the Chinese also know how to personalize things. And I used to, have to guard against this. They say, oh, I know you're an old friend of China and you have the wisdom to make sure that our countries, or make sure that the Vatican and the Catholic Church in China get on well together. And they play to vanity. So sometimes it's vanity alone, but God knows, quite literally.
I mentioned Bishop Serrando, Marcelo Sanchez Serrando, said in an interview that China was the ideal instantiation of Catholic social teaching. Now, I'd love to say that that's naivete, but it seems maybe willfully so. The idea that communism on the ground is somehow reflects what the Catholic Church has taught about dictatorship and free speech and
well,
the dignity of labor and laborers.
All of the above. And so, I mean, you can do the circuit of what's happening in Hong Kong and the violation of human rights, the terrible crimes that have been committed against the Tibetan people and the destruction of their homeland, the lack of respect for their religious faith. And now there's great growing crisis in the far west of China where they're turning it into a prison camp. So anyone who has any kind of sense of what's going on in China, and by the way, none of this has been a secret, and it didn't just happen. Mm-hmm. Tibet has been happening for decades, and Xinjiang has been problematic for decades. But even within China itself, you mentioned Stephen Mosher. I mean, he was one of the people who helped us to understand all of the effects of the one-child policy and the sort of diabolical effects, which China is now paying the price for, as things tend to develop over time. So how any educated person can say that is almost inconceivable. What they generally do is they say, China pulled, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It is true that the Chinese economy has developed and many people are out of poverty. There are still a lot of people in poverty. But the cost of that, the fact that the government that committed the Great Leap Forward, that massacred people after what's referred to as liberation after they took over, when the target set by Mao would be percentages of a Chinese province that is bigger than most European countries. I mean, some Chinese provinces have 90, 100 million people, and Mao would say something like 2 to 4% should pay the price for this. The party's drenched in blood. This can't be ignored. And when serious people who normally deserve our respect say things like that, it's quite shattering. It really makes you wonder, what's going on.
You mentioned Western China and prison camps and so on. Is that the Uyghur people?
Yes. Yeah. So
because they've sort of floated around on the fringes. Tell us who they are.
So the Uyghur people are a Turkic people. Let's not forget that China is, I talk about it in my book, as the unfinished empire. It was an empire when Rome existed and when Greece and it was it was developing colonies in Syracuse and places like that. And it's still an empire. So it contains the Tibetan people. It contains various, Chinese refer to them as minorities, but these people that they've captured, conquered in various periods. This includes the Uyghurs, who are a Turkic people, so they generally look like people from Central Asia or from Turkey. They're a Muslim people, a Sunni Muslim people, and they've been in what is now Western China, was once their homeland for many centuries, and the Chinese have tended to. Mao's approach to minorities was, don't rock the boat. Well, we won't be gentle with them, but we're not going to provoke them. This has changed over time, particularly as China needs the land and the water and the minerals of Xinjiang. And as China needs to pacify its borders, because beyond Xinjiang are the stands of Central Asia. So suddenly Xinjiang has strategic importance. So you have Han Chinese pushing out there, you have the Chinese state pushing out there, really violating the rights of the Uyghurs, some pushback from the Uyghurs, which is branded terrorism. And now you have China imprisoning, more than 1 million people, bulldozing sites. I saw this when I visited Xinjiang a number of times. I saw this, 6 and 7 years ago. It's been ramped up. But what we're seeing too is this very, very chilling use of technology. China is the 21st century surveillance state, and it's using Xinjiang as a proving ground. So its historical wrongs against the Uyghurs are shocking. But what's more worrying is what it says about the future, because all kinds of dictatorships are lining up to buy this technology where they can tell who you are by your gait, by how you walk. They can tell
Yeah.
whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or using this technology, and it's absolutely frightening. And we should be far more concerned than we are.
I've had a couple of friends, one on the military side, another in entertainment, who've done extended tours of their own duty in China, and similar anecdotes arose. And one of them is they were warned by their Chinese friends, if you're out in a park or something, don't talk politics. The benches and some of the trees are wired. You're literally being surveilled constantly. And the other thing is the widespread access and total normality of porn use. A lot of Chinese businessmen use strip clubs as the way the Koreans use golf courses. It's a totally different default setting and attitude toward marriage and family.
You also have something called social credit. So
Right.
so
Yeah, this is very interesting and scary.
So you get a social credit score, which determines whether you can travel, whether you can be upwardly mobile, whether your child can go to university, et cetera. They check the score. You lose your social credit score if you are heard to say things that are considered sensitive. If you talk about subjects you don't appear to be supporting the party. You also get it if you misbehave in public, or you have a meltdown at airport terminals, or if you do anything, you don't show up in Xinjiang, if you don't show up at all the places you've got to show up at the right time. But this is something that includes every Chinese citizen, and you're constantly aware. Should I say this? Should I go to see this film? Should I buy this book? Or is this going to hurt my social credit score? It's again diabolical.
Even like, is your part of the sidewalk swept well?
Yeah. Or have you read this text
detail.
I just sent you? And I can tell whether you've downloaded it, and I can tell how much time you've spent on it. So yeah, China is moving into the future with real enthusiasm.
5G seems to be off a lot of people's radar with respect to the danger to the world if China becomes the leader in running 5G technology. It's stunning how accurate, how pervasive, and how detailed surveillance technology has become. I understand that because I've interviewed Brigadier General Spalding, he just said flat out, anyone who engages with a critic of the CCP is automatically kind of a person of interest. Mm-hmm. And perhaps it's done by bots. You said something earlier about the surveillance of each Chinese citizen. I understand it's also true that when Chinese nationals travel, to say to university in Canada or the United States, they have handlers. They have to have regular meetings to kind of just see how acclimated and influenced they are by democratic ideals and things like Christian faith.
Is that very okay? Definitely. So China has education counselors in their embassies and consulates. So the person in the consulate in Los Angeles would probably be responsible for the southwest of the United States, all the universities there. And so on the one hand, it's looking out for their welfare. It's kind of the nanny state. They're, they want to check up and make sure that they're eating. And okay, it wouldn't work in the West, but just a different place. But part of it is monitoring. Mm-hmm. And so they will recruit students on campuses to say, who asks a question in the poli-sci class when the subject of Taiwan comes up, or who's part of the Tibetan Students Association. Here in Canada, recently, we've had two incidents, one at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, just not far between Toronto and Niagara Falls, where Chinese students mobilized to block a speech by a noted Uyghur human rights authority. And in the University of Toronto has a variety of campuses. The one in the east end of Toronto in Scarborough, a young woman of Tibetan origin became the student council president and was immediately confronted with student activism. In both the McMaster and the Scarborough College cases, there were references to checking with the consulate. And it appeared, the consulate, when asked, said, we didn't do anything, but we support what was done. I've been increasingly interested, and I've written about new legislation that the Australians have introduced, which says that if you're acting for a foreign state, representing a state-owned company or delivering talking points for a foreign country, you can do that in Canada, but you have to do it transparently. You have to tell Canadians that you're doing that. And if you're a minister, or a former minister, or a former senior official, that's it can be a lifetime requirement. If you have the honor to serve the public, you have also the responsibility to be transparent about it. So in this case, if a student group is acting as a proxy for the Chinese state, in Australia, you would face criminal sanctions if you weren't transparent about it. And I think that's where we need to go in Canada. We need to know,
Sure.
where the talking points came from, who's activating these folks.
Yeah, law is the great teacher.
Yeah.
If you're, this is a good thought experiment. If you run a university, see what happens if you invite the Dalai Lama. See where the pushback comes from.
And I've watched this over time. I helped to organize the visit of the Dalai Lama to Ottawa when I was running the Asia branch of Foreign Affairs, and he met with then Prime Minister Paul Martin, and that was he's come a couple of times since. To his credit, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper said, "It's up to me whether the Dalai Lama comes to Canada. He'll come sometimes. Sometimes, I won't be available. But I'm not going to let China determine when that happens." Since then, we haven't had a visit for a number of years, and of course, the Dalai Lama is now getting older. China has succeeded in rolling back his space and his profile, which is a great tragedy, and it shows what happens when you accommodate China. They push and push and push.
Especially in the area of perception. I know a lot of Chinese financing supports Hollywood movies, and they get to say there was a vetting done of the script of Mulan. Certain messages are not allowed in films, and if they are there, the Chinese will excise them before they get seen by Chinese eyeballs.
And if you make a mistake,
I wanted to ask you. Go ahead.
Sorry, if you make a mistake with a flag on a T-shirt, or you've got the wrong slogan, you call Taipei and Taiwan something that China considers wrong. If you're an airline, you'll be forced to change the designation. The T-shirts will have to be recalled. We saw what happened to the NBA when Daryl Morey, made his very welcome in a free society statement. And the problem is that the Western firms generally capitulate.
Yeah,
including the
correct.
NBA,
which makes the NBA almost a wholly owned subsidiary of the CCP, insofar as they're afraid to speak up. How much of this is powered by? There's a concept on page 46 that got me interested. I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation. Guanxi. This connection that you call on someone, is that sort of quid pro quo in Chinese style?
Yes, and so the idea is that life is a continuing, negotiation where you accumulate debt, you pay off debt. So if you invite me out to lunch, we may have a great time, but now I owe you. Now we could say, well, that's true in Western society, but it operates on a very different system. Your teacher, your most important, high school teacher, has a lifelong claim on your guanxi, and anything he or she asks you to do, you got to be there. Relatives, elderly relatives have this connection. Your bosses can demand this of you. And it's very, very transactional. So China is always trying to create this sense of obligation. See what we've done for you? And they use this. I mean, even, who gets pandas at their zoos? China is always trying to monetize that or cash in, monetize in terms of political influence. So it's a big deal.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up pandas because I learned a lot from your book. You have, first of all, China, where do I start? Panda bears are considered like unto Chinese citizens. If a baby panda is born in Austria or Toronto or Miami, it's a Chinese property.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you run a zoo anywhere in the world and you have a panda bear, you pay the CCP $1 million a year for that animal, correct?
And
astounding.
And there's a lineup. It's also an indicator of your relationship. So Prime Minister Harper, who was a conservative, who was in power from about 2006 to 2015, was frosty with China. So no pandas for Canada for a number of years. Finally, they decided that things had, improved to the extent that we could get 2 pandas on loan. And so we had to negotiate the final stages of that while I was in Beijing, and I mean it was a full court press, and every Canadian minister who came through was dying to get the latest on, because it works, right? The Chinese aren't stupid. They know that this captures your attention. What often happens in any kind of negotiation, whether China's being friendly or as they currently are with Canada, unfriendly, is they get inside your head, and without doing anything themselves, they encourage you to think, I better not do this because China might not give me the pandas, or I better not do this because China will crack down further on my citizens. China may not be planning any of that, or they may be planning, but they don't really, want to make a public show of asking you. They get you to make those decisions. And very often the result is you go much further than China could have hoped. It is inside your head.
Mm-hmm. Did the fact that Prime Minister Harper and his attitude was more on the frosty side, did that impede what you were trying to do as the ambassador on the ground? He was Prime Minister when you were ambassador, correct? Your years overlap.
Yes.
Because it sounds like I detect a tone in your book, because as I can say this to a fellow Canadians, where even when we're royally ticked off, there's a kind of undercurrent of kindness, and I can sense the frustration in your being kind of as an ambassador, a lion, but a lion without teeth, and I can see a great love for the people of China as distinguished from the system under which they live. That's a distinction of anyone with any interaction with China. They love Chinese people, and I mean, really, truly, they would give their lives for them. And but the line stops when it comes to not speaking out against the CCP.
So, as the Canadian system is it's a nonpartisan professional public service. I went to China with two Liberal prime ministers, Chrétien and Martin, and I served there when we had a Conservative prime minister. So in 2009, when I got there, the book was that the Chinese lectured me across the board. Every call I made, this is how unified the system is, whether it's a big Chinese company that buys Canadian wheat, or it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or a bank or a university. Everybody had the same talking points. Your prime minister is too cold, Canada is too unfriendly, yada, yada, yada. And so I heard them out, and we talked about the basics of the relationship. Harper was different. He did not accept the consensus that China is necessarily our lifelong friend. He wanted to speak. He was particularly concerned about the fate of one Canadian citizen, a man named Hussein Chelil. He was a Uyghur from Hamilton, Ontario, who was picked up by the Chinese in Uzbekistan and flown into China. The Chinese then said he's a Chinese citizen, he's not a Canadian, and they imprisoned him. And Prime Minister Harper was very critical of the department he said, the department I work for going along to get along. He said, you guys never want to rock the boat. This is a Canadian citizen. So he made this his cause célèbre. And yes, it probably meant that some things were put on the back burner. But as I thought about it, I said, it's kind of what a prime minister should do, right? Caring about Canadians. And he was very frank. We got to a stage, and I think with Prime Minister Harper, we came closest to doing what we have to do in the future. And that is thinking intelligently about, our economic relationship with China. We've got to talk, goodness knows, we've got to talk to China about health issues. We've got to have a dialogue with them. Canada was hit by SARS very hard because of China. We've all been hit by COVID. So you got to have this dialogue. Yep. But he was also quite willing to push back. And so you've got the happy face and the not so happy face, and he managed it better than his predecessors. So in the end, I came to appreciate his frankness and his focus on Canadian interests.
I just found a headline from this week's Globe and Mail. It's by a Robin I'd never read before. Her name is Robin Urbach, and she opens it this way. In just the past 18 months or so, Beijing has held Canadian citizens hostage, slapped us with economic penalties, lied about its outbreak of disease, perpetuated its Uyghur ethnic cleansing efforts, reneged on a 50-year pledge to respect the autonomy of Hong Kong, disqualified candidates, and postponed Hong Kong's election. In response to it all, Canada has grimaced and frowned. The headline is, this is pretty brilliant. If Beijing isn't careful, Ottawa will deploy its scathing finger wag.
Yeah, I saw that piece this morning.
That's
yeah.
That headline would not happen under Prime Minister Harper, I don't imagine.
So
wouldn't have to.
A number of things have happened. The Prime Minister has been struggling with his approach to China. About 5 years ago, he appointed a former cabinet minister to be our ambassador to China, a guy named John McCallum. And that imploded when John McCallum said in a press conference that he had teed up with only Chinese language media in Canada that, it's in our interest to return the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou, who's currently in house arrest in Vancouver. He was replaced and still is replaced by the former global head of McKinsey, a very bright, capable person called Dominic Barton, but someone who himself has said that he was bullish on Xi Jinping's Belt and Road program. McKinsey is a very China-friendly company. So we've got a lot of people who tend to see China through a particular prism. And my argument has been that that prism isn't valid. We need to see China in a stark new light. It doesn't mean that we condemn China or we go out of our way to provoke China. It doesn't mean that we don't have any dealings with China, but we have these dealings in a completely new way. And I'm frustrated that the government just seems unwilling to even consider this.
I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you think that it's possible that China will self-implode in a way similar to the implosion of the Soviet Union after 70 years of communism there?
I think there are very savvy people in the Communist Party, which is, it's a very adaptive organization. There's a very distinguished guy at George Washington University called David Shambaugh, and he wrote a book about China, which I love. It's called The Communist Party of China, Atrophy or Adaptation. And it shows that this organization that learns, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Communist Party of China went through a 10-year process of trying to figure out why did the Soviets had been like the guiding star for all communist parties. Why did they collapse? And how do we avoid that from happening? And they said they collapsed because they lost touch with the people. So the Chinese Communist Party vastly increased its membership, and they have what we call intra-party democracy. They'll have debates inside the party itself. But nothing goes on forever. And Xi Jinping is trying to push this out into the future. The problem is, and the basic point of tension is, the party sees itself not as a body that has to answer to the law, is subject to the law. It sees itself as the font of the law. The law is whatever we say it is. That engenders corruption over time. And this is the corrosion, the rust on the Chinese system. And it's, even though Xi Jinping has launched his own anti-corruption campaign, every Chinese leader does, it's not going away. And it builds resentment among the Chinese people. The deal has to be, and has been, we're going to grow the economy. You can get your own condo. You can send your single child to university, maybe even in the States, but we'll do all the governing. And that's held up until now, but it begins to fall off the rails if the economy slows down. And that's precisely what's happening. The other things that are happening is demographic disaster because of their meddling in things like the one-child program, and environmental disaster. The north of China is essentially a desert. Beijing is in a desert region. Their soil is polluted. Their rivers are polluted. So there are these growing challenges with a party that is incapable of reforming itself. I don't think it will implode in a spectacular big bang. I think it will be increasingly unstable, a little bit like Russia is now, unhelpful, unstable, but only much more capable and much more difficult for all of us to live with and to kind of manage.
Maybe that slower implosion will be aided and abetted by missionaries. As I mentioned to you in an email, I was almost halfway through your book, and I thought, I wonder if he knows about Father John McGoey. Boom, there he is, Great Scarborough Foreign Mission Society. The order was founded on so many great heroes, mainly from Canada to China. And I want to put a plug in for Nor Script Nor Shoes. I'll put a link in patrickcoffin.media.
Wonderful.
This is Father McGoey's, one of his 14 or so books. Father McGoey was my spiritual director for a time in Toronto. I was one of his pallbearers, and it was an honor to spend time with that great man who suffered so much for Christ and the church, but also from his own illnesses that he kept surviving. And Father McGoey despised the Chinese government, but he really, he just gave literally poured his life out for the people there. And you mentioned, I asked you about Guangxi.
Yes.
Did I butcher it again?
Connected this, yeah.
That's the kind of witness, someone like Father McGoey or someone like Cardinal Kung, who will willingly go to jail as a witness, in a way to provide a counter witness to the people who are unwillingly jailed. It doesn't matter who you are. That kind of heroism on your behalf makes people sit up and take notice.
There's a classical figure in Chinese history and literature of the Mandarin who is uncorrupted, the scholar who speaks the truth even to the emperor. And so the other thing that you hear a lot of Westerners say, including Western CEOs, I call Chinese leaders CEO whisperers, because they say, we don't really have democracy here. We're Confucian. That's so insulting. It's so wrong. China has produced great heroes. Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Prize winner who died in prison, was a great champion. Ai Weiwei, try to tell Ai Weiwei that there's no democracy. This guy is he's a feisty Democrat. So there's this tradition in China of respecting the honorable person who does the honorable thing, not the person who makes the easy deal with the state or sells out his own interests. That nobody respects that. So there is. I was very interested in the subject of religious freedom when I was serving as ambassador, and I tried to go and visit. I went to mosques when I traveled. I went to see. I fought with the Chinese to go to Tibet, because China is very, very stingy. The Chinese ambassador to Canada can go anywhere he wants, but I had to negotiate. And what they generally do is they make, like, all the Scandinavian countries have to go together. All the Western Europeans have to go together. Canada's lucky because our natural partner is a place called the United States of America, which is considered such a handful that they said, okay, Canada, you go on your own. We got to do a full court press when those Americans come calling. So I got to go by myself, but I fought for every single thing that I wanted to see and do, because they wanted to fill my time with useless banquets and lectures by Han Chinese people about how great things were in Tibet. But when I went to the Jokang Temple, for example, and I saw the people circling the temples ceaselessly, some, on their hands and knees, you get a sense that there's something happening in the hearts of people here. The only thing that was disconcerting was moving counterclockwise was the Chinese patrol. An armed patrol which would push these people aside. The last person had a fire extinguisher, because of the only thing left to many Tibetans in desperation is self-immolation. So it was a scene of both great spiritual vitality and a sense of a forlorn sense of something approaching defeat. But there is a flame of faith and belief that burns in right across China.
And you were able to arrange Holy Mass inside the embassy compound?
Yes.
For foreign nationals only?
Yeah.
That must have been hard to kind of say no to others and yes to your own.
I met a priest I'd known in Taipei, an American priest, who said, David, we're meeting in, we have Mass at in the ballroom of a hotel for the foreign community, but it'll get canceled if the government is cracking down on the church. And by 2009 it was. We used to have it in the embassy. We don't have it anymore. Would you consider opening the embassy? So the first thing I had to think about was, you got to be careful when you do something in government that benefits you. So I'm a Catholic. So Catholics, as you know, tend to know who the other Catholics are. We met as a group who were interested in Mass. The doctor with the Public Health Agency of Canada, Dr. Felix Lee, became our leader. We set up a program where we would do the sweat equity. So one of the things I enjoyed most was Sunday morning putting out the chairs. With the parish, we worked out the cost of the extra security to bring all those folks in. And at Easter, we'd have 250 people from every country in the world, lots of Americans, lots of Africans, lots of people from around Asia. But I couldn't let in Chinese citizens. And why couldn't I? Because I would have been breaking the law of China. And when I went to China, I put my hand on or when I joined the Foreign Service, I put my hand on the Bible and said that I would serve Canada faithfully. I used to say, I wasn't assigned. I'm not the ambassador of the Republic of David Mulroney. As cool as that would be. I'm the ambassador of Canada, and so it also would have meant that our mass got shut down. Mm-hmm. I remember one Palm Sunday, as we were gathering for our procession around the courtyard of the embassy, just seeing people looking through the gate, and I thought, maybe if that alone speaks to them, if they get a sense of what we're doing, and the guards and the local staff felt it.
Yep.
But I just couldn't. I couldn't break the law as ambassador.
Mm-hmm. Similar vein, we read about Falun Gong. I understand they're behind the Epoch Times, which is one of the only news outlets speaking critically about the regime. They're pro-life. They're essentially conservative. I know very little about their beliefs. Tell us a little bit about Falun Gong.
So Falun Gong is it's a mix of exercise and sort of health improvement and spirituality, and it had quite a hold on people. It's a well organized. It has lots of adherents, and it became extremely popular in China about 20 years ago. I think because there is such a hunger, there's such a search for meaning, and this is something that gave people a sense of meaning. And what happened was some of the adherents were so organized and so together that they arranged to appear. It was one of the first uses of text messaging to gather a crowd. They showed up to stage a protest outside a place called Zhongnanhai. Zhongnanhai is the compound of the Chinese leadership, and it's like ground zero for the Chinese state. And this it freaked out the Chinese leadership. How could these people have gathered? Who are these people? And then President Jiang Zemin said, we got to look into this. And what they found was it was, white collar workers, army officers, scientists, doctors. So it's the core that the Chinese Communist Party needs. They decided to break Falun Gong. And they broke them in the most barbaric way possible in China, and they pursued them around the world. And, there are all kinds of allegations of, using the organs of executed Falun Gong practitioners, torture of Falun Gong practitioners. It's been a grisly crackdown that continues to this day. But as you say, the revenge of the Falun Gong is that they've reassembled in the West, and they're telling a story about China that's very compelling.
Mm-hmm. Kind of a more secularized equivalent of the saying from, was it Tertullian? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the faith. When a dictatorship cracks down and tries to crush something, logos is always rising. Divine providence is always bringing evil and clarity out of evil. Goodness and clarity.
I had an interesting experience when I was running the Asia branch, and I dealt with the Chinese ambassador was someone I dealt with a lot. We had a situation where their consul general, China's consul general in Toronto, criticized a Canadian Falun Gong practitioner. This person was not of Chinese ethnicity, and this Canadian had been speaking out against what was happening in China, and so the consul general attacked him in the pages of the Toronto Star. And the Canadian said, I'm going to sue you. So the ambassador called me and said, there's this incident in Toronto, please make it go away. And I said, well, first of all, Ambassador, as you know, consular immunity isn't the same as diplomatic immunity. Consular immunity relates to your function. So you can't be arrested or harassed for doing your duty as a consul. But if you stiff the dry cleaner or, don't pay your bills, or you're subject to Canadian law. And so he said, you write to the judge and tell him to send this case, packing. And I said, well, that's not how it works. I said, I will write to the judge. And the one question the judge asks us in the foreign ministry is this person a Chinese diplomat? And we write back and say, yes, he's a consul. And here's consular immunity. Well, the result was the guy got sued. And we said, we're not raising a finger. And he eventually left the country before, the judgment was rendered. But it was a symbol of how willing they were to use free speech in Canada to attack a Canadian citizen. And this was, 15 years ago. It's only become more egregious since.
Maybe we can end with the title, and maybe you can fill out, because I was pondering middle power, middle kingdom. The phrase middle power opens up a lot of doors to understand the West's relationship to China. What do you mean by middle power?
Middle powers are countries, and Canada, I think, Canadians probably claim coining that phrase, but it means a country that is not a traditional great power, not the United States, not China or Russia, not even Britain or France. It's a country like Australia or Canada or Sweden that's in the mid-rank of countries that has to make its own way in the world. And China, of course, refers to itself as the Middle Kingdom. The book was inspired by my growing concern that, as the world changes, by the way, I'm not someone who believes that China will overtake the United States ever. I think China faces too many problems itself. But the world will be more multipolar than it has been. It means that Canada is going to be more responsible for navigating in that world. We have benefited greatly from the system of alliances anchored by the United States and created by the United States in the Pacific since the end of the Second World War. We all benefit. Does the United States benefit? Absolutely. But so does Canada. Increasingly over time, this was true, I think, in the Obama administration, it's true in the Trump administration, America is, in my view, less inclined to think about this or to think about the maintenance of that alliance. And that's a problem, I think, ultimately for America, but it's a problem for countries like Canada. Canada, on its own, has failed to invest and to pay its own way in the alliance. So you have American impatience with countries like Canada that are seen as free riders, and a lack of awareness in Canada about what this means and where it's going. The answer should be that Canada invests more in its security and its defense than it has, and that this should perhaps trigger a reappraisal in the United States of the importance of this alliance system. The fact that China is so egregiously trying to pull away both Canada and Australia, for example, from the U.S. alliance is something that should be of concern in Washington as much as it should be of concern in Ottawa and Canberra. So we all have to wake up, but Canada's got to pay its way as it navigates in a much more complicated world.
You mentioned in the book that the United States has kind of been distracted by foreign wars, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, engagement in the Middle East and so on. It seems to be a tide shifting under President Trump, where he's more of the bring the troops home mode, and perhaps that's why he's casting a lot of eyeballs on China. And the old saying, if you can't fix it, feature it. The first thing that comes to mind about featuring things that are happening in China is the social media platform TikTok, which is owned by ByteDance, which is a subsidiary of the CCP. India has banned them. President Trump has signaled that he wants to ban them. This is not just a harmless, cute, 30-second video platform. This is a data gathering collection tentacle. Do you see things going forward quite different under President Trump as a Canadian former ambassador?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that the first decade of the century represents 10 lost years in terms of, the pivot to Asia, in terms of countering China's growing aggression. It's proof that things like, balance of power really exist. If the United States is more distracted, some others will try to fill that gap. What China hopes to do is to push the United States, and that means the U.S. Navy, out beyond what they call the first island chain, which runs through Taiwan, out beyond the second island chain, which means out beyond Guam. That would be a disaster, not just for the United States and countries like Canada. It would be a disaster for East Asia because China would have complete control. It would be a disaster for Taiwan. So one of the things that I say to Canadians is we have a stake in this. And what would really be important is if we contributed more to the defense of the Western Pacific, to East Asia, to show that it's not just some kind of Sino-American rivalry. Countries like the United States, Canada included, all want to respect China, they want to work with China, but they have a stake in a rules-based international order. This is an issue that China has with the democratic world, not just with the United States. I think President Trump his China policy has been successful, more successful than we've seen in a long, long time. If it looks a little bit bumpy or abrupt, it's because it's catch up, right? These are things that should have been done a long, long time ago. I think the moves that have been taken against, for example, some of the Hong Kong leaders, totally appropriate. And I've been advocating that we do something similar in Canada. If you take away human rights in Hong Kong, you don't get to go to Whistler or Banff for your vacation. You don't get to go shopping in Toronto, just as you can't go to the U.S. So yeah. I think there's a logic to the U.S. response. I think it's more painful because it is so late in the day, but it's not too late.
Well, I hope people listening do what I did, read the book, Middle Power, Middle Kingdom, What Canadians Need to Know About China in the 21st Century. There's a sort of another subtitle in the inside jacket that I like a lot. China's dramatic rise is shaping Canada's future and the U.S.'s. We need a better plan. I hope it gets what it deserves, which is a wide readership, and I really appreciate your time, Mr. Mulroney. No relation to the Brian Mulroney, right? He's a different side of the Irish tribe.
A different side of the Irish tribe, and the story my family told very quickly is there was a divide in 1916 where I think his family were a little bit more feisty. My great-great-grandfather was a Royal Marine. Like a lot of Irishmen, he served in the British forces, and so when he got to Canada,
right,
in the late in the 19th century, he said, "We're part of the Commonwealth. We're part of the Empire now, and so that's behind us." Mm-hmm. So it was an Irish politics that divided us.
And you have a brother, Brian. That's funny.
I do.
Yeah, I like the story of him saying, was it Prime Minister Trudeau is on the phone?
No, it was Brian Mulroney.
I thought it was a prank.
I called him when I was.
Oh, that's right. It was a Brian Mulroney call.
And I called him because it was after President Ford had died, and I called him to ask on behalf of the Prime Minister to go to the funeral, and he was calling back with a readout, and I thought it was my brother on the line. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, I've learned a ton. I love the book and love to keep in touch. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for the great work you're doing. Great to talk to you. All
right. My tagline is "Be a saint, what else is there?" How do you say that in Mandarin? Be a saint, what else is there?
It's been too long for me. I would mangle it.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint, what else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.